Hello and welcome to the Colaba Conversations. We're focusing on fintech, an industry that is into a big piece of evolution, looking at new markets, new audiences, many new players, and also putting traditional banking systems up for big change much sooner than might have anticipated. We're putting the spotlight on women. She invests women as market makers. And I've got two very special guests with me, Shilpa Kumar of Omidyar Network India. I've got Radhika Gupta, MD and CEO of Edelweiss. Looking at just Edelweiss AMC, well, let's just dive straight into this. For me, it is one of the most compelling spaces that women are going to embrace both as makers as well as takers in this sector. Shilpa, what is the pulse of the fintech industry so far as women are concerned that you're reading in 2021?
So I think if you kind of first look at fintech, who are they trying to solve problems for? It's really the entire universe, right? I mean, which one can say roughly is 50% men and 50% women. But when you look at the people driving this change, whether it's fintech entrepreneurs themselves or even investors who really fund these entrepreneurs, you would kind of think that are there sufficient women represented in both these sets which can really help drive this change? And why do I say that? Because in the end, if you want to serve a population which is like I said, comprising both men and women, you need to have entrepreneurs who understand these needs and who can drive products and services towards both these sets of people. And to me, therefore, it's really interesting that when you look at all the money that went into startups, let's say in the year 2019, only 6.5% of it went to founders that were women. And I think that's something to think about.
No, absolutely, and I think that it's important that you brought that up because I think increasingly businesses across sectors are looking at women as a big market, which I think they should have started about 30 years ago. But that said, very few of them have that deep nuance of what exactly or how does one navigate those markets. Perhaps we can get a sense from Radhika. Radhika, as the CEO of an AMC. In the fintech world, how do you approach women? Do you think there is a certain specific approach that needs to be taken to feed into female audiences?
So yes and no. And firstly, I would say that one of the things, and when the listing of Nika happened, I said, regardless of what you think of the listing, one thing you can't underestimate is the economic potential of the Indian woman as a consumer. And it could be a consumer of a beauty product, it could be a consumer of a fintech service, it could be a consumer of a mutual fund. I mean, the fact that 50% of the population is a very powerful consumer, and by the way, this 50% also takes household decisions. So actually, the influence of this consumer is much vaster. I think that is absolutely undisputed. And before I come to your point, I would absolutely echo what Shilpa said that, if you're designing for a consumer that is 50% women, then naturally your representation as an entrepreneur, as a venture funding system, as a mutual fund house also has to represent women. Now, it's not that women consumers, and we see women consumers, I mean, all capital market industries have seen a proliferation of number of people and consumers over the last year, all financial services industries, whether it is broking, whether it is cryptocurrency, or whether it is mutual fund. We've seen an uptick in consumers. I don't think the women consumer is very different from the male consumer in one way, but definitely needs to be spoken to in a different voice. And I think that is where traditional financial services has lagged. So I think the women consumer is a similar consumer, but needs to be addressed with a very, very different voice, which is why I think the participation of women at the producer and maker stage is very important.
Yeah. Shilpa, how would you respond to the piece about speaking with women in a different voice?
Yeah. So I think more than different voice, I think sometimes what happens is as we take decisions, there's always at the back of everyone's mind some form of unconscious bias, and it comes, I would say, from a good place, right? I mean, it comes from, okay, I see things in this perspective, and therefore it may be so. And therefore, actually, to my mind, it's a little bit more about consciously taking into account what might be different perspectives, what could be other ways of looking at things. And if you ask me, like, what's that single one word which makes all the difference, I would say it's being conscious and being deliberate about how you think about things and try and get various different perspectives on board.
So let's talk about women as investors, right? And here I'm again talking to them. Talking about them as sort of the ones who would go out there and invest in retail investments, mutual funds, and so on, at the receiving end of product and services. Now, looking at that, it's not new that women are interested in investing. It's not even something that could be called fresh research. They clearly are. The question is, how do we scale that up? And it's maybe it doesn't need to start at a certain level. Like, I was talking to one of the government ministers recently about entrepreneurship, and I said, if you can do beti padhao beti bachao at a national scale, why can't you do become self-reliant with entrepreneurship? Do we need campaigns, conversations at multiple level on that front when it comes to women becoming financially independent and free?
I think we need multiple things, Sherry. I think campaigns will definitely help because, and I talk to women across the income strata. I talk to women in the lower segment of the strata because a mutual fund consumer is everyone. And I talk to women in the highest end who come from, business families. And when you ask them, why don't you invest? And investing is not passively investing where you have an account and someone's doing it in your name. A lot of it is honestly sheer inertia. They admit that there is information out there. There's no shortage of information out there. In fact, thanks to fintech, there are at least five, six major fintech platforms out there targeted to women. So I don't think that's a shortage anymore. There are many of these conversations happening. A lot of it is just inertia. And I think the second thing is a belief that it is too complicated for me to get involved in. I mean, these are two major elements that come into play. I think campaigns can help. I also think financial services. I think women can do with a lot more role models to make sure that investing is not difficult and that entrepreneurship is accessible. I think role modeling is a very very powerful behavior. Unfortunately, the impression of finance for a lot of women still is it's an alpha male field and this is inaccessible to me. This is technical and this is complicated. And I think both role modeling and campaigns to that extent will definitely help.
Yeah. Shilpa, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I completely agree with what Radhika said. When I was actually leading the wealth management business at ISEC, and I used to have these conversations too. And two things struck me. One is the number of women, and some of them really accomplished women. If you ask them, hey, who handles your finances? It would inevitably be the husband or brother or father who was managing it on their behalf. And it's so surprising because, on the one hand, there were people, doing great stuff on their own. But on the other hand, the self belief to manage their own finances was not quite there. What really touched me also is the number of cases I handled where there were women who suddenly when they lost that significant other, it could be husband, father, suddenly realized they had no clue what to do with their wealth. They didn't even know how much wealth they had in some situations.
Yeah.
And therefore I feel like financial kind of knowledge and financial literacy, I mean, it's almost a life skill that every woman also needs to have. um, yeah.
Yeah. So I just want to ask you a related question, Shilpa. I'll come to you first and then go to Radhika. So if one looks at India's fintech adoption rate, we're second to China, and the number of companies that are offering some form of, whether they're wallets or digital payment ways, and of course the government's own UPI. There is suddenly such a massive, sort of compression in the journey to becoming somebody who can have partial control over one's finances. So, given that, do you think that until we actually get something going on the ground, women could potentially miss this bus? Because while they're showing signs of digital money adoption or digital payments adoption, maybe the rate is not up to the mark.
Yeah, can't agree with you more, Shaili. And let's take the example to the extreme, right? I
Yeah.
mean, if you look at who's excluded currently from our financial system, if you don't have a phone, you're excluded. If you don't have identity, you're excluded. And if you just take, and it's a sad statement that a lot of times even digital access for women, they depend on the significant other in the family for that. So it kind of starts with that sometimes. Of course, as you move up the income curve, maybe that changes. Maybe more women have their own phones. But at the same time, the literacy levels and therefore the desire also to be financially literate, I think both are important, really need to be stepped up. But let me say one last thing. When I look at, some of the companies we funded, let's take Pratilippi. It's a self-publishing platform. Bulk of the customers are women. If I look at, say, Kaleidofin, which is kind of designing products to meet the needs of women, again, bulk of their customers are women too. So I feel if, with the right attention, with the right information, and also maybe by seeding the desire to learn, I think we can overcome that obstacle.
Radhika, do you see any sort of trends between rural and urban approaches to fintech adoption?
So I think rural is, I think, that the challenges are very, very different in rural. I think accessibility remains the biggest challenge because, in urban India, we take having a mobile phone for granted. I think that remains the biggest challenge. It remains a challenge with all technology enabled industries. At the lower income strata, even online education remains a challenge. So I think the story is very different outside of credit, where there are separate solutions for women. I am more optimistic about urban India. I think a generation of women that is probably the one after mine. More women are coming into the workforce, that is certain. And as we have conversations with consumers, nearly everyone in their 20s is asking the conversation of should I start saving and should I start investing? I don't think this was happening. This was definitely not happening in my mother's generation. I don't think it was happening even in mine. So
Yeah.
I think younger Indian women on average, Shelley, is becoming more aspirational about everything, not just her career, but also her money. I think it's tied beautifully because I have probably about 10 of these conversations a week. And I think in urban India, that's and with a lot of these platforms that have opened up for women, more conversations are happening. I also think I would say one thing this this problem and conundrum can't be a woman's one. It has
Yes.
to have men in the conversation. A lot of the challenge that women have is how do I even start? How do I even have that conversation with a significant other that money is a family matter? This was a big issue after COVID. I'll build on a point that Shilpa said that women found themselves displaced because they lost a family member and they didn't know what the assets were. In some cases, women were directors of family owned companies and they had loans on their head and they didn't know that they existed. So, this conversation always has to be a family conversation.
Yeah, indeed. So, a related question there, Radhika, for you. I mean, there are statistics to show that while there is some amount of adoption, I think just under 30%. But if one looks at the large number of dormant accounts sitting in India that are owned by women, that's part of the problem. And then the fact that there is so much focus since 2014 on the Jan Dhan, Yojana. Do you think some of these efforts have helped? And you said let's bring men into this conversation. I want to hear from you as a company in this business. How much of the government intervention thus far is showing its fruit on the ground?
I think things like Jandhan, etc., are a positive step in enabling you to have a bank account. Has anything been done, to actually convince women to move from a dormant account and start taking decisions? I don't think so. I think, and I love the idea that if you run a campaign like Beti Padhao, Beti Bachao, and it's almost become, a household thing. I mean, it's very similar to our mutual fund Sahi Hai. Why are you not running a campaign now, Beti पढ़ा दी बच गई पढ़ा दी वी हैव मेड दैट स्टेप बेटी को एजुकेट करो और बेटी को इंडिपेंडेंट बनाओ where is there space for phase two of that campaign? So I think you've given women the enabling infrastructure. You've done Jandhan, you've got bank accounts. Through FinTech, you've made everything very accessible. If a woman wants to avail credit and she has a mobile phone, she can. If she wants to invest, it's all out there. But you haven't given that extra push to say you need to do this. This is you have to go out and do this. Just like Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao said, you have to get a woman educated. I don't think you've taken that next step.
So, I mean, we've all heard this before. You educate a woman, you get a large community impacted, you change a family's future, you have a different approach to investment and savings, and so on. Shilpa, in this entire process, have you come across other countries where we have lessons to learn from? You know, one of the things that India has, both a plus and a negative, is that we are so excited by our numbers that we just talk only about the numbers and we forget whether or not they're having a material impact. A great case and example is what we all have been talking about, that women may have access to the account, their name to the account, but how much agency do they have on their decisions with that stuff, right? Where do you think that will get solved? And is it fair to expect these large number of fintech companies and banks to play a role?
Yeah, I think certainly there's a big role to be played, both by fintechs, banks, everybody in the chain. And, I feel like why look outside when there's such lovely examples right next to us in India, I mean, within India. So let me give you some illustrations. For example, what's the biggest asset any family has? If you think about it, it's really their home, it's their land. So a simple thing like, trying to see when you're lending money for a home or for land, how many women are also listed as owners. Can you do something which says if a woman is a joint owner of a property, the government could say, okay, it's entitled for a better rate of interest or something like that. So we actually have invested in a company called Sitara, which really says any loan we give, the joint signatory to the loan and the owner of the house has to be a woman. So I'm saying it's like simple steps like that that can really help and can enable access. And let me say just this, we when you look at rural India, since you spoke about that a minute ago, uh, a lot of the men from rural India actually come to cities to work,
Yeah.
and it's really the women who are managing the farms, the day-to-day work, all of that. And if they're so empowered, if there's so much agency, why can't that just be channelized also into financial literacy and assets?
Yeah. So here's another question, which is, and I often think about myself as a potential consumer, of any financial product. Do you think that if women have it packaged in a way that is at a point at a delivery point, which is not a bank that looks scary, right? Especially, let's say, in semi-urban India, where you have all these sort of metal barriers to cross to enter a bank, and then this massive table between you and the manager, and so on and so forth. Do you think there is a different model to think of? So there are fintech companies that are offering financial services straight up, but could there be one which is a non-fintech company partnering a fintech company and making it far more widespread and a lot more easier to touch and feel as a concept? Both of you can go at this. I mean, maybe, okay, Radhika first.
I don't know. And I don't know if the answer lies in whether it is a fintech company or whether it is a non fintech company. Part of me believes, Shali, that the products and services are already out there. In fact, one of the things that I believe we have too much of in financial services is a proliferation of products and services. And honestly,
Mm,
it's creating too much chaos for the consumer. I look at my own industry, which is the investment industry, and the amount of choice that there is actually, it's scary for me. So I can imagine how scary it is for a consumer. So I don't know if more products and services is the answer. I think delivery of them is an answer. For instance, in our industry, one of the things that we say and one of the things that we observe is, if you increase the number of financial advisors out there, you will increase the number of women investors, because when a woman has a conversation with a woman financial advisor, and all the data will tell you this, there is a lot more comfort, a lot more of those barriers break. So you don't need more products and services. You need more people at the distribution level and at the ground level who are women, who can bring more women into this conversation.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Shilpa, any thoughts?
Yeah, Radhika's made some wonderful points, but let me add that, one of my experiences, at least in financial assets, was that typically the best way of, financial conviction coming in was if someone you trusted said that to you.
Mm.
And therefore, like, what's that circle of trust which is closest to you becomes really important. And sometimes, that circle of trust may extend to a fintech, but sometimes, and especially for those who are somewhat more excluded for whatever reason, the circle of trust is important, that it's someone in that circle of trust who persuades them into this new mechanism. Otherwise, like we saw in Demon, almost every Indian, woman in the country said, okay, here's my kitchen jar, and I had some cash in it. So it's
Yeah.
really the circle of trust that becomes very important.
Yeah. A very quick question there, Shilpa. You know, you said that it's important to have that circle of trust. This also makes me wonder, again, as an observer of a lot of what's going on in fintech, is that I don't really see very many fintech companies, whether they're banks or otherwise, really talking about women investing in, in any form of investment, and certainly not using trust as a lens, which is a low hanging fruit to fix, but hasn't been.
Yeah. No, but if I look at fintechs, and I think the magic words nowadays are embedded finance. And if you look at, say, insurance platforms, it's like, hey, are you buying an airline ticket? Why not buy insurance? So that's really what's happening right now. And I think the same way, just extending your point, if a woman's day-to-day kind of interaction is with a certain person, can that person who's a trusted kind of point of interaction uh, be someone who helps them on their financial journey? Having said that, Shaili, I think Radhika made an important point that in the end, financial products, at least of a certain category, need an advisor who's kind of
Yeah.
certified.
Yeah.
And therefore, you have to have the right balance of, is the person who's giving or sharing suggestions, equipped and literate enough to do so themselves, or like the insurance world has done, are there certain products which can be pretty much off the shelf products, which can then be loaded into what you're suggesting?
That's right. That's right. And a very important element of this is how often are women in the fintech world talking about the importance of fintech in lives of everyday women. And I would say this, even though we are discussing fintech in a panel at a platform where pretty much everybody is sort of a converted person, is that perhaps women like yourself need to be in spaces which are not talking fintech, and you're talking about financial independence and freedom in a way that resonates with somebody who has thus far been removed from that space. Radhika?
I agree. And I think, Shali, you made a very good point, which is that I think the conversation in financial services and financial product sales, whether it's insurance or whether it's capital markets, needs to move from a finance conversation to a goal oriented conversation.
Exactly. Yeah.
This has been my argument in the mutual fund industry for a long time. We are not sellers of financial products. Ultimately, whether you buy insurance, mutual funds, anything else, loans, they fulfill an objective. And the good thing about women is, and what makes them statistically also better investors, is they are very goal oriented. In life, they've been brought up to manage goals, whether it's household goals, kids' goals, and they manage goals well. And if they know they're working towards a goal, they also stick around. I mean, these are hard habits to cultivate. So I think if a lot of our conversations move away from what I call technical finance, returns, this, that, etc., to more goal oriented and solutions. Kya milega iska? I mean, India has always loved that line, na kitna de diya. I mean, what will this do for me? What problem will this solve for me?
Yeah.
X, Y, Z, mutual fund, insurance doesn't matter. But what will this achieve? Will this change my financial life? Will this enable me to get a better education for the kid? What is the goal I'm solving for here? So I think the financial industry also needs to move towards that narrative, which is something that I've been pushing for a very long time.
Yes, we need to make the financial world sound like bread and butter. That satisfies a very important piece, which is hunger. Just like, I guess, I have seen so many women in the stock market in the course of the last 20 years on business TV, just saying, I want to be part of the dhanda. I want a return. I want to make money. We make making money by women already stigmatized so much in society that, when it comes to new products, new services, new platforms, that the hesitance is often so inherent, a habit hard to break. But great, I'll have literally 30 seconds for closing comments. As one thing that you think over the next couple of years would be a trend to watch out for, Shilpa, starting with you.
Yeah, I think the Indian woman is going to be an important consumer, and I think business are going to sit up and take notice, and I really look forward to that.
Radhika?
I think if the Indian economy has to meet its aspirations, then you can't afford to ignore the potential of a woman as a consumer, as an employee that drives the bottom line, not for some random diversity initiative, and as a potential founder. So I think if the economy has to meet the kind of potential, you'll do a disservice by ignoring the potential of the Indian woman in all three areas.
That's true. And for me, I think having built She the People in the last 7 years, my big takeaway has constantly been that women need to be communicated with and have a relationship of trust if you want them to come on board anything. Even more so in the new economy where the opportunities coming at them are many, and few of them could potentially manage to stick and make that big difference in the lives of many unbanked, unfinteched women thus far. So let's all make a big effort to break down the communication to something drastically simple, not because women are not intelligent enough to understand complex things, because you need to sell an important product and women need to make money. Thanks so much for joining us on these conversations. For the rest of the program, it's back to you guys.